For over 20 years, the Bukit Panjang LRT has served residents of the Bukit Panjang and Choa-Chu-Kang neighbourhoods, acting as a feeder service connecting commuters to Singapore's MRT system. For most of its existence, the system has been served by its first generation of rolling stock, the C801s. However, ever since they entered service, the C801s have been riddled with issues, and the LRT network they operate on has been plagued with breakdowns and disruptions, making it Singapore's least reliable public transport line. The history of the C801s tells a fascinating story of poor hindsight, mismanagement and inexperience, which forced an otherwise reliable train model onto an incompatible and unreliable network. And their legacy would greatly influence Singapore's public transport network for years to come. In 1994, approval was granted to construct an LRT system within the growing town of Bukit Panjang. The contract for the procurement of rolling stock was awarded to the American company Adtranz, and an order was placed for 19 Adtranz CX100 automated people movers. The CX100s were a tried and tested train model with a good reputation, having been used on numerous driverless systems around the world, such as the Frankfurt Airport Skyline. In fact, similar trains were even used on the Changi Airport SkyTrain in Singapore, where an older version of the CX100s, the C100s, operated between 1990 and 2006. The 19 train cars were built in the United States between 1997 and 1999 under the contract 801, or C801, thus giving the trains their name. Upon delivery to Singapore, the trains were lifted onto the tracks and stabled at the newly constructed 10 Mile Junction depot. The C801s had several features unique to the Bukit Panjang LRT, such as misting windows, which turned opaque when the trains passed housing blocks, thus protecting the privacy of residents. The trains also featured LED screens, which were used to display information about the LRT system as well as advertisements. However, these screens would later be removed due to a lack of demand. The Bukit Panjang LRT opened on the 6th of November 1999, becoming the first ever feeder system of its kind in Singapore. To operate the system, SMRT created a new subsidiary company, Singapore Light Rapid Transit, or SLRT. Many residents looked forward to the prospect of being freed from the congestion of roads, instead travelling within sleek and quiet new trains. However, the initial public enthusiasm for the LRT would be short-lived. The C801s had a bumpy start to their service lives. Within its first 6 months of operation, the LRT suffered 32 service disruptions, ranging from power trips to doors opening slightly while the train was in motion. Given the novel nature of the LRT, some disruptions were to be expected as SLRT ironed out the issues and got used to operating the new system. However, as time went on, the disruptions never stopped, and it would only be a year before the LRT suffered from one of its worst incidents. On the morning of the 19th of November 2000, LRT trains came to a sudden halt when an alarm sounded in the operations control center, indicating that a train had gone missing and could not be accounted for. Normal procedure would only allow train service to resume once the missing train had been found. However, an officer on duty decided to override the system, allowing trains to resume running as per normal while staff attempted to locate the missing train. Unbeknownst to the Operations Control Center, the missing train was stopped at Platform 2 of Phoenix Station, without any passengers on board. However, since service was allowed to resume before the missing train was found, the trains operated under the assumption that the platform at Phoenix Station was empty, when in fact it wasn't. At around 7:45 am, an LRT train carrying 20 passengers departed Teck Whye Station and began travelling towards Phoenix, completely oblivious to the train that occupied the platform. Approaching at a speed of 16 km an hour, the two train cars collided. 3 passengers suffered minor injuries from the collision, and one of the train's couplers was forced downwards, hitting and damaging the power rails below. After the incident, one train was moved to 10 Mile Junction Depot, while the other had to be manually pushed by officers over the damaged power rail before being taken to the depot for repairs. It was concluded that the collision was due to human error, as correct safety procedures had not been followed. As a result of the incident, SLRT would go on to install backup train detectors on their fleet of C801s at a cost of between $200,000 to $300,000. Alas, the Phoenix collision would not be the last of the C801's problems, with the LRT suffering its largest ever service disruption just 2 years later. On the morning of the 21st of October 2002, an LRT train on Service A, carrying roughly 12 to 15 passengers, had one of its 8 guide wheels dislodge and fall off while in operation. The guide wheels of an LRT train are located underneath the main body of the train car. These wheels help keep the train car attached to the single guide rail that runs along the tracks. Despite missing one of its guide wheels, the affected train continued travelling along the tracks for around 6 minutes, causing severe intermittent damage to a 1 kilometre stretch of the line. The train only came to a halt when the damaged track tripped the power supply between Bukit Panjang and Senja stations. SLRT initially announced that repairs to the tracks would take just 1 day to complete. However, by the next day, repairs were still underway, and SLRT pushed back service resumption by another day. This deadline would also be missed, and it would take nearly 4 days in total for LRT service to partially resume, only for the system to face yet another disruption less than an hour later, when a train came to a sudden stop for 10 minutes. The cause of this entire fiasco would turn out to be a missing pin that was meant to be inserted within the guide wheel to secure it, causing the wheel to dislodge and fall into a trough in the track. Human error was once again to blame, and the reputation of the LRT had suffered because of it. In 2003, one member of the public even suggested that the entire LRT system, barely 5 years old at the time, should be scrapped completely in favour of reverting to a conventional feeder bus service, a suggestion that would be echoed by SMRT 13 years later. But we'll get to that later on. In 2004, SMRT and its subsidiary company SLRT merged, and the Singapore Light Rapid Transit Company ceased to exist. To reflect this change, the C801s adopted a modified livery with a single red stripe for SMRT, replacing the 2 turquoise bands which had previously represented the now defunct SLRT. It was also around this time that the C801s had their wheel guards removed, possibly to allow for easier access to the wheels during maintenance. As the years went by, the LRT would continue to suffer from disruptions, and the system failed to be the cutting-edge public transport revolution that LTA and residents had hoped for. However, most of these disruptions were no fault of the C801, but were instead a result of issues ingrained into the very design of the system itself. Automated people mover systems, such as the LRT, tend to be employed at airports, where trains make short journeys between terminals to ferry passengers. Such systems tend to have straight tracks with few sharp curves to contend with, and the Bukit Panjang LRT was one of the few systems which used the CX100 in regular commuter service, a job that they simply were not designed to do. This was not helped by the fact that the town of Bukit Panjang wasn't designed to accommodate the LRT in the first place. When the system was built, tracks were forced to swerve around sharp corners and climb over hills to squeeze the tracks between HDB blocks, resulting in notoriously violent and uncomfortable journeys. All this strain gradually took its toll on the C801s, and the reliability of the system deteriorated because of it. In 2014, SMRT began to consider carrying out a midlife refurbishment program for the C801s, similar to the midlife refurbishment program carried out for first-generation trains on the MRT. Such a refurbishment would have upgraded the train's air conditioning and air compressors, as well as improving their brake system, among other things. However, these plans would never come to fruition, Instead, SMRT would favour replacing the entire C801 fleet with new rolling stock altogether. In the same year, the C801s were joined by a second generation of rolling stock, 13 new C801As, which nearly doubled the capacity of the LRT. This enabled the LRT to shift from primarily single-car operation to double-car operation, culminating in 2019 when the LRT began full double-car services. However, the first generation C801s, by now over 10 years old, had begun showing signs of their age. In 2015, during a routine assessment by Bombardier, it was discovered that the entire C801 fleet had developed cracks on their underframe, with some cracks stretching to nearly 12 centimeters in length. These cracks were caused by normal wear and tear after nearly 2 decades of service and were repaired locally. However, they were a sign that the end was in sight for the aging fleet. In 2018, LTA awarded the contract for the replacement of the first generation C801 fleet to Bombardier, later known as Alstom. The successors of the C801 would be the C801B, and they would bring much needed renewal to the network, with improved air conditioning and energy-efficient lighting. In November 2023, Car 101 became the first C801 train car to be formally decommissioned, and just 9 months later, on the 1st of August 2024, the first 2 C801B train cars entered service. As the months went by, the C801s were gradually pulled from service, as C801Bs were delivered and came in to take their place. With no fanfare, the last trains disappeared from the network in September of 2025. The C801s come from an enthusiastic era of Singapore's transportation network, where the adoption of an LRT system was seen as an exciting leap into the future, a notion from a more naive age. Of course, the adoption of an LRT system turned out to be far more complicated and nuanced than previously thought, and the lessons the Bukit Panjang LRT taught us were later applied during the construction of the Sengkang and Punggol LRTs. As for the C801s, they took the LRT through tumultuous times, heralding a new age for Singapore's public transportation. They were the first ever driverless public transport vehicles to operate in Singapore, if you don't count the aforementioned Skytrains at Changi Airport. And it was from their trials and tribulations that lessons were drawn, allowing Singapore's public transport network to grow and innovate.